Welcome back. In this session, Lee and I continue our conversation around best practices implementation for CDK pipelines using an end-to-end pipeline. And yeah, have fun and enjoy the second part of the session. So you said you have a CDK pipeline for this that others can actually then use because you have open sourced that, right?
That's right, yeah. So let's have a look on the left-hand side. So what we can see here, very high level, obviously we kind of covered, we've got the client application. I won't go into the code because it's just a React app. We've got the Cypress tests, which again, I won't delve into too much. Very similar to Jest. We're just going to go through as a end-to-end kind of customer and end user and do things like load the particular page, check that the title's correct and what have you. And we've got one for creating an order. And we've covered the Husky setup, docs, so obviously just the readmes, what have you. And the tests at a very high level, we've got the Postman collection that's going to exercise the API. And we've got the load tests, which for artillery, for anyone that hasn't used it, you can create test data in a CSV file. And you can then run through different scenarios at scale, bring up lots of virtual users, as if you've got many, many people using the system. So that's outside of the application around the edges. And the main actual application, if we have a look at this, we've got this split into 3 core folders. The app is made up of 4 different stacks, which are not specific to any environment. I think that's key here, because what we want to do is build one set of immutable, deterministic files at the very start, this kind of cloud assembly, and progress that through. So what we'll cover in a second is the config side. So if the config's deterministic, if you build your feature dev, your staging and prod at the very start of the pipeline, even if that pipeline takes 3 weeks to go all the way through to prod, all the way through your manual approvals and all of your testing and what have you, nothing's changed. You're not going to do a CDK deploy at each of these different steps and then have a different cloud assembly and find that some kind of environmental factor, like an environment variable changing on a server, has then caused an issue. So that is one of the key things with this. So these 4 different stacks, like I say, are, as we see here, very basic client stack for the front end. So an S3 bucket, the CloudFront distribution for the reactor. So I won't delve into that too much. We've got the actual feature flags themselves, which sets up all of the app config sides, the app config applications. And you would get one of these for each of these different 3 environments that we talked about on the right. And this is where the actual config is actually stored from a feature flag perspective in the code. And the reason for this is we don't have somebody going into the console and changing this feature flag and turning it on or off, or changing things like this particular example here is saying that when this is enabled, only particular groups can perform this action. So you might want to just have a beta group using this and what have you. But obviously this enum here, the great thing about having it in config is we can snapshot test it, and it's TypeScript, so we can actually pull these strings or magic strings from somewhere, a file internally, a NPM package, as opposed to somebody going into the console in the app config and manually typing in beta group and making a mistake in there. So that's the approach we take. I know Ran does this from CyberArk, but he has a separate pipeline entirely for his config. In this regard, I've put it in the same pipeline because, it's one kind of code repo.
So that means that if I want to enable a feature flag, I'm going to need to go through a redeployment at the end.
That's right, a redeployment. And, from chatting to Ran at length, and the reason why they do it in a separate pipeline, they don't want the config item to go all the way through all of these various tests to then be enabled. So that makes absolute sense. You have a separate pipeline
Yeah.
So it's very, very quick. But in this regard, in this example, I didn't want to create another pipeline. It would have just been verbose and too much.
And that makes sense. Yeah.
So that's the config feature. Like I say, it's very deterministic at the very start of the build.
At the end, I think, sorry for interrupting, this comes down to having feature flags within the pipeline. Kind of, you would want to have a pipeline that is used to run only config changes, and you would not want to have a pipeline that is used for running the whole deployment. And this should be then automatically configured or automatically identified as you run through the pipeline. I think that would be the next level of making this kind of work, right?
100%. Yeah, that would be a much better way of doing it. That definitely, because in this example, like I say, these feature changes are going to have to go through all of the testing phases before going to prod. We've got the stateful stack. Again, this has no notion of which environment or stage it's going to.
Mm-hmm.
This is just creating things like the database and what have you in the background. And you can see we've got CDK NAG embedded here for all of these kind of SAST style tests.
Okay.
This is an example, so I've suppressed a lot of the warning signs in here. And then finally, the stateless stack is very much about the front end, things like lambdas and, it's not the kind of back end, the stateful side of that application. It's not about databases or queues. It's more about the lambdas and synthetics and what have you. So these four, like I say, make up, in this regard, what I call a stage. So if we go through to the pipeline itself, we can see we've got a pipeline stage. And this stage would be a kind of environment, so an account and a region, say. So as we go through, we can say we create a stateful stack, we create a stateless stack, a client stack, and we have the feature flag stack at the top. So these four parts constitute that application at that point. And what that allows us to do in the pipeline stack, the stack which is actually going to generate the actual pipeline itself, as we go through this, we can see all of these properties are actually setting up, the code pipeline aspect of this. But the interesting thing as we go through to the actual stages, we can see here we're creating a feature dev stage using those four particular stacks. And we're running through the things that we see on the right-hand side of the screen. So I've added a quick health check, which hits the API that's being deployed. There's a very, very quick check that it's working. We run the integration test. So we can say it's just an npm command, which is calling Newman, which calls the Postman side. And then we've got the acceptance tests, which ultimately, after doing a little bit of building the client application, it runs Cypress Verify to run the tests. And you can see we're passing through, as part of that kind of code pipeline, the actual endpoint of the front end application. And then we just do the same with staging, but it has different tests. Obviously, as we go through, we've got things like load tests. But again, it's very easy to see, very easy to set up. It's very visual. So we're running artillery here, pointing to the load test file. We can see when it comes to prod, we've got our manual approval step that we talked about, and whether you need that's another discussion based on the business themselves. And again, we run a health check. But the key thing here is for each of these different environments, we're passing through this part here, and this is very key. This is the deterministic config at the very start. So if we click through to it, we can see here in this pipeline config file, we have all of our actual configuration, which states which region and account it's going to. And we can also see for feature dev, we might say the lambda size is 128, but in prod, it might be 1024. So it's very deterministic, and part of that build as far left as we can go. And that progresses through to make sure everything's deterministic and less chance of an environment issue failing the deployment.
that's cool. Having the pipeline config external, the stack config external, I've not used that myself yet. So that's really cool. There was a question in the pipeline code that I had. So if you could go back to the pipeline code, then there's this pieces that I'm kind of trying to find a way for myself. If I want to have a generic version of a pipeline that I can reuse for all kind of applications, there's the part where you build the stuff, and there's where you execute npm run, npm stages. I think, can you scroll down a little bit? It was like line number 100 or something like that. The acceptance test pieces, right? These shell commands that you have up there, right? They are kind of what I don't really want to build every time. Is this something that you think we could extract as a pipeline construct or something like that? So that would make it even easier for developers to adopt?
Definitely 100%. So this particular construct itself, we could create an L3 construct of the CDK pipeline, which we do have on the left-hand side here anyway, which I didn't actually mention. So we have the notion of L3 construct. So instead of just using the L2 for DynamoDB, we have this simple table construct, and you can push this to code artifact or do a publish to npm, and all engineers can then pull this in, and that allows you to have fixed props. So in your organization, you might always want to have point-in-time recovery on, but you might also want to embed things like CloudWatch dashboards and security. You might want to add particular features into this or particular alerting to remove that cognitive load of anybody that wants to use DynamoDB. But yeah, sure, we could do that at the higher level on the actual CDK pipeline construct itself, and have it where people just pass in these particular props. So that's a great idea.
Yeah, let's stay on the pipeline for that conversation. So I'm working on with another DevTools hero with Torsten. We are looking into building something into that direction in terms of having a generic reusable version of CDK pipelines, or maybe with, let's call it pipelines as a whole, right? We shouldn't limit ourselves, I believe, to code pipeline, right? So I have that open source project where I first want to build the same generic pipeline, which is a little bit simpler than what you're presenting today, right? But in all types of CI/CD systems. And then I want to take that knowledge and that learning from that and apply that to have something that we can use to automatically generate these pipelines and these pipelines files for us, right? And this is where my question comes from. Line numbers 107 to 112, right? They assume some pieces of standardization in your project. As an example, you're using Cypress and you have your client code in the client directory or client folder, right? Now, having that project structure set up automatically gives you the possibility to then also use that when building out the pipeline, right? So this seems like something that could be achieved using Progen. But yeah, I really like seeing the pipeline in code, right? That's really awesome. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
What you've talked about there would be amazing, because one of the issues with CDK pipelines is because it uses code pipeline under the hood, it can be a little bit slow compared to, say, GitHub Actions or GitLab pipelines. If there was an abstraction that just generated that, depending on what you actually pass in as what's going to be the runner and how it's going to run, that would be amazing. It'd be fantastic.
Yeah, let's talk about that offline, right? There might be a way of collaborating here as well, and looking into that. Now, one question that is not really in code: how about versioning of the pipeline itself? How do you deal with that? So I think for those that don't know, CDK pipelines are self-mutating. This means that, what does that mean actually?
So what this means is, as we add additional stages or parts to this, we might say that we want to add, as part of this stage, we run some kind of other testing. The first part of the pipeline itself will self-mutate and add these additional stages, or it could be you want to deploy it to 2 regions, it might be multi-region. It'll do that before it then starts running through the pipeline itself. So it'll self-mutate at the very start.
So that means that the CDK pipelines construct or the CDK pipelines options automatically ensures that if you change the pipeline, the code that you pass through the pipeline will go through the new version of the pipeline, right? And I think that's an important prerequisite, right? Because that means that you don't really need pipeline versioning because the pipeline is part of your application code, right? Which is what I really like about CDK pipelines. And that's, I think, worth mentioning that in this case. Cool. Yeah, I think we had a great run through this project. Anything else you wanted to show?
No, there's a lot of other things in there, like the Lambda progressive deployments and the CloudWatch synthetics and things like that. But people can pull down that code, have a look at it. Like I say, there's 4 very detailed articles that talk through this in detail. So yeah, it's probably one for another day.
Probably, yeah. And I see you have the title of serverless advocate, which you're using to promote your content a little bit. How do you see that role?
Yeah, I've been doing this for a lot of years, writing articles and talking at events and being on podcasts and things like that. And I absolutely love it. Not just sharing articles, but sharing actual code repos so people can get in there and have a look at how it works. Absolutely love doing that.
Cool. And what are let's stop sharing your screen. Then I can get you on screen a little bit bigger. What are the next steps that you see for this project? Are you now done with it and moving on, or are you going to add more details or more content?
Definitely adding more. So there's been some great comments on the articles about, how could we speed it up? Could we look at EFS or other caching options? Obviously you've mentioned some additional things we could look at. So yeah, there'll definitely be a part 5 in between other articles that I write. Definitely.
Okay, cool. And that. And are you looking for contributors for the project, or is it going to be show Lee for Lee only right now? What's the plan for that?
Contributors would be more than welcome, 100%. Yeah. And if we could kind of grow it out to, like I say, be a little bit quicker, maybe add the additional things I haven't looked at on that great AWS documentation, then yeah, it's obviously benefiting people because I get a lot of feedback and a lot of kind of DMs and messages. So yeah, the more people it can help, the better.
This is great. Yeah, and thank you so much for coming on, for showing this to us. And I would be really glad to get you back on, looking at some of the more detailed pieces of the code maybe in the future. Where can people find more about you? We already saw your blog. I'm going to link that to the show notes, but where else can people find you and get in touch with you?
I would say probably the best thing is to type in serverless advocate into Google. So I've got a YouTube channel on there with various kind of detailed videos about things like artillery, load testing, which is covered here. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter. So yeah, everything can be linked to from these articles. If you share the articles, then people can definitely find us.
Cool. Any last famous words for this episode?
No, just thank you very much for the invite. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming and for spending time with me. And yeah, everyone else, thank you so much for watching. Would be glad to see you again. If you have any specific topics that you're interested in, please reach out to me. And yeah, if you're interested in some stuff that Lee's building, feel free to reach out to him, approach him, and yeah, work together. So thank you so much, everyone. Bye bye.